I see that there are people and colleagues getting in. So, I won't tell anything important. It's just more procedural. Welcome today afternoon on day 4 of our opening week. I'm very glad that you're with us. Colleagues, of course, also colleagues from RECET, and then a pretty large audience, as I can see, who are all interested in our, as I called it, sociology or theory panel. Before we will get to our roundtable or panel discussion, I will briefly introduce the participants of this afternoon. I think I will simply go by alphabetical order. So with us is today Marta Bucholc, and she's as I would say, historical sociologist. She has worked on the questions of theory as well, which will be at the center of our discussion probably today in the afternoon. So she has publications on. Okay, that is the sociology of the future. I heard a small baby before, and I always like that. It gives our Zoom meetings a human touch. So please forget from time to time to shut off your microphone. Anyway, so back to Marta Bucholc. Well, she has a strong profile in theory. She's also a sociologist of law. But anyway, the theory profile is probably the most important one for us today. And she has widely published on Norbert Elias, also translated him. I also have a connection to Norbert Elias and have read him quite a lot in his theory on chords and last but not least also on music. And besides these, classical sociological topics, she also wrote a book about the conservative utopia of capitalism. Among the Kupiectwa, that would be the merchants in the interwar period. So there is this strong historical dimension in her work, and Marta, besides all your sociological insights, that's what makes you especially interesting for us, for RECET. But one could say that this is even true for all of Polish sociology. Then we have Klaus Offe. I'm not sure whether I need to introduce him here. Well, he was, I would say, one of the founding fathers of what was later deemed as Transformationsforschung in Germany, writing early on about the challenges and paradoxes of post-communist or post-socialist transformations in Eastern Europe. And so one of the books of that, particularly research focuses the varieties of transition, comparing the East European and the East German experience. It also is important in other regards because East Germany was later on often left out by transitology, as it is called very often in Anglophone countries. And so there it was, and I think it should be there. Germany, at least in parts, is also a post-communist country. And then there's a large variety of books about modernity and the state, again, the East-West comparisons, reflections on America, a book on Tocqueville, Weber, and Adorno in the United States, and then books on inequality and the labor market. And I also, when I was a very young postdoc, I remember listening to a talk about trust. And actually, a lot of historians have taken up terms created or used or specified by Klaus Offe. That is true for trust, it is true for transformation. So I think there really has been a big impact. And then last but not least, there's also among us Joanna Wawrzyniak. from Warsaw. Marta and Joanna are originally academically, one can say, from Warsaw. And she has yet another dimension which is very important for us historians, and that is she's doing a lot of interviews and has reflected upon how to do interviews. So we could also consider her an oral historian. Well, oral history, of course, is based on social science interviews, so there's anyway a large overlap. So she also has worked on theory, on Polish sociologists, writing letters, Czarnowski among them, writing letters to Henri Hubert and Marcel Mauss, so two French sociologists in the interwar time. She has worked a lot on, I would say, almost an historical topic, the memory of World War II and how that is practiced in museums, but also beyond museums. And then there's a very important, more recent book about the oral history of transformation. And I think this is so important because we have, so to say, the official rhetoric of transformation, all the success stories which were repeated again and again. But if you want to understand also what we discussed yesterday with Anna Grzymała-Busse, the backlash, or the, if it is a backlash, the illiberal turn, that's for sure, then I think one can only understand this by looking at the experience of transformation, and that is what she does in this book, Mówiona Historia Transformacji. So these are our three distinguished speakers, and I lined out two questions for our panel. Each of them will be answered in 3, 4, 5 minutes. And the first one is, so to say, egocentric. I'm basically asking you to help us at RECET to develop our term of transformation, which is functioning well as a rooftop term, but I think we have to decide to go beyond that. And so what we are trying to do at the RECET is to, on the one hand, we pertain to the post-89 period. On the other hand, we try to counter the teleological and also regionalized, specified for Eastern Europe, usage of the term transformation. Well, we are doing that, among other things, by relating to current polemic. Now, however, breaking up teleology is broadening a term can also make it very broad, in some ways contradictory, and not easy to operationalize in research projects. And that's, I think, what we should do as well, to have the term not just as a platform for common exchange, but to use it in research projects. And another problem is how to distinguish transformations from the omnipresent, we can say normal, I don't know, historical change. Now we try to do that by pertaining to speed or the perception of acceleration, synchronity, and transsectorality. So here this obviously goes back to this famous essay by Klaus Offe in 1992. But anyway, what I would like to ask our three panelists as the first question is, how do you use the term transformation? Well, if you use it at all, and how do you think it could be operationalized? I didn't suggest a sequence before. In a way, we could go by the good old Polish democratic traditions and have a liberum veto, or just to vote. I'm not sure, but maybe because of the most recent book, we could start with Joanna Wawrzyniak, if that is okay with you, Joanna, and then move over to Claus Offe and then Marta Bucholc. Okay, so Joanna, it's all yours.
Yeah, thank you, Philip, for your invitation to this panel. It's a great honor and it's a great privilege. And as at the gathering of this sort, there always needs to be someone who underscores her own positionality or situatedness. So in this panel, I try to play this role. I'm an East Central European scholar down to the bone. I was raised in Warsaw, studied at the University of Warsaw, and then at the CU in Budapest in late 1990s. When transformation was what concerned academia most, occupied scholars' mindset and the teaching curricula which we got in social sciences. So I would like to try to answer your question relating both to this experience of myself as a student in the 1990s and my current research experience, leaving the grand theory to my great co-panelists who are much better in it. If I understand you well, what you try to do at RECET is to try to disentangle or release the concept of transformation from the post-1989 Eastern European context to make it fruitful for research in other areas of the globe. I think it's a great move, but it obviously alludes to the problem which you just mentioned, how to make it broad enough and operational at the same time, and how to get inspired by Karl Polanyi, the notion especially of embeddedness and disembeddedness without making it too broad. But I think when you speak, and this is where I come to my experience, when you mention, because you mentioned the concept of speed, simultaneity, and scale, or transsectorality as defining factors of transformation. But if you try to conceptualize from an East Central European perspective, and especially of that how transformation was talked about in the region in the 1990s, you cannot miss the concept or idea of the top-down agency, which was somehow associated with it. So the media discourse of the time was highly personalized. The male figures such as Gorbachev with his perestroika, Leszek Balcerowicz with his plan, dissident party members forming roundtables, Jeffrey Sachs unleashing capitalism, or John Paul II giving his blessing to all that, that were the agency figures who unleash the processes. But so there was that notion from imposing that from above. And as you all know, a considerable pile of social science literature conceptualized that sort of agency in more abstract terms, speaking of the role of the states, institutions, and regulation in the processes of transformation, which need to be inserted into the region, or the all discussion about the democratic state, or what type of configuration of check and balances is most conducive for economic growth and social stability, and so on. So, but this leads me to my second point on the transformation as the traveling concept. So in the 90s, it has been largely discussed how transformation travels to East Central Europe from, for instance, Latin America via Washington, or can we learn something from developmental states experience in Asian economics and so on. So, and preparing for today, I look at those old student notes and I was really struck that there were only a few names in my syllabus of the actually scholars from the region. So the whole idea of the Polish sociology is a little bit of a useful myth, but it's still a myth. But we were encouraged to read people like Samuel Huntington, Linz and Stepan, Klaus Offe, of course, Elizabeth Dunn, David Ost, and many others. So some of those authors whom we read were originally from the region, but they already spoke to the region as, in a way, in-betweeners and members of highly cosmopolitan community of scholars. So my point is that studying the trajectories of those conceptual travels of some elements of transformation research to the regions and then from the region might perhaps also reveal something about the transformation concept broader than Eastern European perspective. And the last and final point is what I have found most striking in my current research, which is on the memory of this transformation among the industrial staff, the generation which experienced that in the 1990s when they were in their 40s, and now how they tell the stories of their life when they are in their late 60s, is that they obviously do not tell the story in this abstract form of whatever notions, democracy, market economy, and so on, and not even the figures of Balcerowicz and the personalized stories of transformation, But they tell the stories of the consequences of the opening of the space of experience and horizons of expectation to the processes induced by globalization, deindustrialization, and digitalization. So there is no wonder, because transformation opened the East Central European societies to post-Fordist type of labor relation. And this is what you can really see in their life stories. So from this perspective, I really share your view that it's worth to come back to Klaus Polanyi's notion of disembeddedness brought by unleashed market forces once again. These are the stories the people say. They say how the entire fabric of social relation collapses in 1, 2, 3 years in the moment when the companies become privatized. So I love Polanyi, I'm fine with him. However, as a scholar doing biographical interviews and oral history and studying vernacular memory, I would opt for such a definition or understanding exploration of transformation that takes seriously into its research focus the effect of the abrupt changes on the space of experience and the horizon of expectation of entire societies, even if different layers of groups in the societies experience that change in various ways. But this is, I think, you just want to do in RECET, right? Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks a lot. Also to your multiple references to what we're doing and to Polanyi. Let's move on to Klaus Aufe. Now Joanna had an experience with reading you in the late 90s, and now I'm very glad to listen to you speak. By the way, we also use the text. I use it for my seminars, the 91 text, and students still love it. Okay, now it's your turn.
Herr Offe, Sie müssen sich unmuten, wir können Sie nicht hören. Okay, you're unmuted somehow, but we still cannot hear you, and I don't know why. Mr. Offe, we cannot hear you.
Is this better? Is better?
Yes.
Okay. It is as loud as I can speak. Okay. So this is a huge agenda of conceptual, theoretical problems and issues that we in the social sciences are dealing with. What do we mean when we speak of transformation? Transformation is clearly a major event affecting all sectors and all actors in society. Of course, you can speak of the transformation of the shipping industry through the introduction of the container in the 60s, has transformed the entire industry and made it for, but that is probably a inappropriate use of the term. It's a change, technological change, economic change in the industry, and so on. So another aspect of the semantics of transformation is irreversibility. Once it has happened, there is no way back. Transformation is the opposite of routine, continuity, tradition. Furthermore, we associate with the term a transformation a notion of agency. Someone is initiating, guiding a major process of historical change according to ideas and values that are shared by many others. That is a implication. It's not a blip. It is not an accident. It's not a short-lived and reversible event, such as hopefully the regime of Donald Trump in the United States, where we return to normal, it is a permanent change. And it is an active response. Transformation is an active response to change conditions. And we need to respond collectively to a challenge or a crisis that needs to be overcome. And sometimes it is framed in terms of the TINA logic. There is no alternative. We must go this way. And often there is a ongoing conflict over the right way to shape a transformation. And according to a set of concepts that were popular in the 90s, right after the events of 1989 happened, is that you have the breakdown of a regime, then you have the transformation, that is the invention of new constitutions and other institutions. Then thirdly, you have the process of normalization or consolidation, and after that, perhaps a process of deconsolidation. So it's not an eternal change that has been achieved, and so the degree of contingency and the degree of choice is itself a very controversial aspect of the process. Some people still speak of the events of 1989 as a revolutionary process driven by a collective will of a popular agency. Other people, in contrast, speak of a implosion of an old regime that was and a very sudden and surprising implosion of an old regime that was no longer able to maintain itself. And these are different views and ongoing controversies concerning what is widely described as transformation or transition. There was a conflict of conceptual strategies in the early literature of the 90s, where some people spoke of transition, which means the goal of the end result of the process of change is fixed and known ahead of time, as it were. We need to arrive on the other side of the other end of the bridge, and we know exactly where it is, namely liberal democracy and plus capitalism, following Western models. Others are much more uncertain about the fixity of the end result and see transformation as an ongoing process of finding and building a bridge wherever it leads on the other side of a river. So there are a lot of ambiguities in the concept of transformation, and it is possibly it is probably impossible to resolve this conflicts, but there are ongoing debates on how best to use the term transformation and what to associate with this, and that is good. This is stimulating, and this is an ongoing debate, and we should not aim at a fixed, dogmatic, and consented conceptualization. That's all we can do. That's it.
Okay, thanks a lot. Marta Bucholc, you're next.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Philipp, for having me here. Thanks to all of you for being here tonight, or it's not tonight, technically speaking, but for being here now. And I'm very happy that Professor Offe introduced the motive of the ambiguity and also of the necessity of keeping, sort of saying, this notion of a transformation underdetermined, so to say, so as to make it more useful. And this, well, I have been introduced very kindly by Philipp as a social theorist, and please bear with me if I speak in this capacity and indulge a short reprisal of the sociological traditional thinking about the change. Philipp, you said that it's very difficult to distinguish transformation from the ubiquitous social historical change. Well, I would say that it's also very difficult to distinguish it from the equally ubiquitous social change. And of course, well, in sociology, we always had this focus on change, and there is this notion of sociology being born out of the reflection about the society's changing. And I think it's, well, there are many arguments for that, supporting this history of our particular discipline. But there are new modes of thinking about changing and the changing in society that have been, well, on the highway for a few decades at least now. It somehow coincides with these changing trajectories of thinking about the history in sociology. So if we begin with the very old, very, very old Comtean tradition of thinking about society as a combination of change and stability, of things that are there and are being preserved, and things that are somehow on the move, then sociology might be depicted as always moving between the two extremes, as focusing more on what is preserved, on stable things that are later on all labeled structures, and on the processes of things that are changing, on this physiology, so to say, of the society. And up to a certain point, this was just either here or there, and there were very few synthetic efforts. And one of the things that I like about Norbert Elias, my favorite social theorist, well, by the long run, it's that he was actually a synthetic theorist of a social change. He wanted to put this structure and agency together, even though he did never naturally refer to them as such. And it's no accident that Anthony Giddens was a student of Norbert Elias, and that this mode of thinking actually originates in the Eliasian framework, combining the micro and the meso and the macro, and combining agency and structure. But then there is a certain trap in this quest for a happy solution of the agency structure puzzle. And the trap is as follows. The longer we look at society as, so to say, soaked with agency and structure at the same time, the longer we seek this synthesis, the more difficult it gets to really set a limit to any particular process of change. Everything is changing. There are plentiful metaphors of the society being constantly on the move, being liquid. This is probably the most, by far the most popular, the most known metaphor of Zygmunt Bauman, of the society constantly accelerating, this whole block of metaphors related to mobility with Hartmut Rosa, but also John Urry, of the morphogenetic processes in the society with Margaret Archer, and also the whole block of relational sociology stressing this constant interactional move between the actors. So it's all constantly on the move, it's all constantly happening. And if it's all constantly happening, then it's very difficult to say when the particular thing that we want to study is happening. And one key to setting this limit might be what Joanna does in her work, which I admire very much, and I can tell you that now publicly, which is the focus on the experience. But if I may play the devil's advocate for a while, well, and drawing on a good old classic on Charles Wright Mills, well, sometimes there is an experience behind the transformation. Sometimes people can tell you a story of how their world has just literally broken down in a few years. But sometimes there isn't anything like that. Sometimes there is just uneasiness. Sometimes there isn't even that. Sometimes people just have troubles, which they experience as troubles. And you have to put in a defining effort, conceptualizing effort, to translate these troubles, personal things, into issues that you can study sociologically. So experience can be misleading, which I think, well, is just a warning that stems from the long sociological tradition of theorizing change without referring to experience, which was, of course, also wrong.
Thanks a lot to you as well for giving a lot of food of thought for the discussion later on. Okay, I think it's not easy to summarize that, and I won't even try it, because, well, to get back to Klaus Offe, that the ambiguities are good. Let's keep them for the discussion. But anyway, what I could see here was an interesting well, experience for me. Nobody tried to build a model, right? Which is also a very long and good sociological tradition. Also with Norbert Elias, the model of the free composer, for example, to have a very late one in his works. Anyway, there's this modeling, you refrain from that, and I think experience is also so helpful because it puts the focus on actors in the agency, which sometimes can get lost in sociology. We had a panel with the Shipyard Project 2 years ago at a big sociological convention, and I gave a speech, and you know, I counted, well, after a while I feel provoked to count in the sessions, in the panels, when do they ever talk about people, about actors and agents? But however, of course, that was a German sociological convention, not a Polish one. And you know, this is why we are, one of the reasons why we are so keen to cooperating with Polish sociologists, and why we are also very happy that Agata Sisiak will join us. And I think, well, there's at least some way to at least to summarize one positive result, I think, is the experience obviously leads to a historical dimension, right? And it needs to be transmitted in a qualitative way. So it needs to be communicated. And I think that is already quite a lot to go after transformation in this way. Also, of course, it still might look very holistic and unspecific, but I think that there's something about that. So that is, you know, my very brief and spontaneous thoughts about the first question. But to be discussed, of course, and also your critical remarks about, well, how to find the specific is there if there is always omnipresent change, and how to go after this specific change and transformation, and how then indeed to combine the micro and the macro. Let's move to the second question. A second key feature of RECET and already past, already even completed research projects is the combination of classical archival sources or archival research. You know, that's what historians always do. With social science interviews as practiced by oral historians, but of course also by social scientists. So there are certain differences there, but I will not talk about that. So my second question is, how do you think these approaches, or the and sources, can be combined? So the archival, which usually means written, and the interview, which only has to be written, right? And how have you combined these kind of sources? The second question is there something you would like to communicate for us, for the general audience? But again, I'm egocentric for us at the RECET in the coming years. Oh, we need a sequence. And maybe let's go with the same sequence again. Sorry, Joanna.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for this question. So I can tell you how I do that, but there are many other possibilities how you can do that. But it's important not only how, but also why, what for to do that. So who needs it and why? And I'm doing that a lot. I'm combined because I have both this history and sociology education. I'm sorry, but something got wrong with my camera. Now it should work. So I have skills, the historian skills, who still privilege archives, and also the social science experience. But I'm also involved in the milieu of the so-called memory studies scholars and oral historians who mix the methods. So I have the double experience. Or I want to comment on the double experience which I had. One was when I was writing my doctoral dissertation, which was based mainly on the archive materials, and I was interested how the memory of the Second World War was constructed in communist Poland. And I was looking through the various associations of veterans and victims of which were formed in the early period of communism, and then they were merged into one association. So I did mainly, I went to the archives, but I knew that the archives, not all the stories are in the archives. So I wanted to fill some gaps. And I did some interviews which were probably the most classical oral history interviews which you can conceptualize in historiography, that you basically fill the gaps in the knowledge which you cannot find in the written sources. But it gave me much more because it gave me new hints and ideas which I didn't find there, and then I reconceptualized my main argument thanks to that what these people told me, because they just simply unveiled me the social spaces which were just non-existing or hidden in the archive. So that's one thing. You just complement the other sources by the oral history, but that's obvious, I think. The other is, this is what we do now, and this is where we really privilege the subjective over that what really happened and over the reconstruction. So if we try to reconstruct something, this is how the people remember and how they tell the past, and we try to give the voice to the people, if you want to refer to that strand of the oral history. And in here, most of the sociologists who do that type of the narrative biographical interview, which we do, or oral historians, don't really feel they need to go to the archive because they already have enough of the material on its own standing to make use of it. But still, I think archives are useful because, especially if you do it in some sort of the milieus which do not have, say, official historiography as that, or the historiography is not that developed, because you need to somehow position those stories, and this is why I think I'm quite conservative, position those stories against some context, and in that. Our last research, that context was the context of the stories of the factories, which were not written. So you needed to go to the archives to see how many people they employed, how actually the privatization process went on, and so on. So what happened underground, but only to have it as a background story against which you present the effect of what you did. And here comes two modes of that, what you can now do. You can either show you can do your own analytical work, and this is what most of the scholars do later on with that rich biographical materials which the people shared with them. So you look for the meanings of that, what they tell, the narrative patterns, all of that wonderful conceptual framework which Fritz Schütze and then his followers actually developed, which we can use to analyze such interviews. But and then you just build your own interpretations on the basis of that, using that concept or other and present this order and present somehow that subjective order which you gather in your research. But then there is also another thing which you can do with such a material, and this is what we actually did in our book, which was mainly meant as a public history or engaged sociology. You can call it as you will, but it is what you do with such a material. You reveal it to the public because you want the public to engage with the stories the people tell, because they don't have access to those stories otherwise. So the scholar is the one who makes it possible, but kind of hides herself behind the people whom she lets or they let to speak. So that was actually what was behind the reason behind our last book. And why to do it? Well, there are different reasons, and which we know from the history of public history or oral history on engaged sociology. But I think it's still really important in the region in East Central Europe, because of transformation being really divisive and dividing factor as it is constructed in the political terms. So that was Professor Grzymała-Buze spoke about that yesterday, but we also obviously know that from both reading the papers and reading the social science research. And the way to expose and to propose what we did, we kind of put into the book the stories of different people, of both those who were restructuring the companies and those who were fired by them, by the managers, trade union members, party members, different sorts of individuals who shared these stories. And we hope that the book is kind of the meeting or encounter point for the diverse groups in the society to at least meeting there in a book. I think Katrin Lebov, who might be with us, she wrote once a beautiful article on the tradition of biographical research in Polish sociology, and the role of the publishing these memoirs of the unemployed in the times of the Great Depression. And that was a big event, kind of, the memories of the unemployed were published in the 1930s. And as Kate Lebov says, they offer hope that the narrator and the reader may, at least for a moment, on the memoirs page, share the same skin. And this is what you can also do with the subjective, with the subjectivities in sociology and historiography. So you either propose your own framework, or you give it as a material to the people to think over their past experience and the role of the others in that experience. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Klaus Aufe.
Mr. Offe, you're unmuted, but maybe it's your volume. Try to put up the volume. Lautstärke. Now.
Is this better?
Yes,
Yes.
Now it's working. It must be a plug from the headset.
Okay, I'm sorry. If I may come back to our previous discussion, I found very important what Marta said about the key term confusion. Transformations may result in something very different from intended objectives and goals of the agents. There may be a kind of confusion or trouble or new instability. Failed transformation is something that we want to consider here, and even the concept of anomie is perhaps useful in describing a situation where the transformation has at best mixed successes and all kinds of unanticipated as well as unwelcome outcomes can be observed. And I think in a comparative perspective, one would look at successful versus frustrated transformations. And I thought that is a helpful distinction to be made at the conceptual level. But now at the questions of archives and versus interviews, and for me, the social sciences deal, and that is trivial. It is Sociology 1, first session. Deal with objects that are themselves theorizing or reflective. The distinction is the natural sciences deal with such things as molecules or cells or species. They do not have an awareness of themselves. They do not theorize about themselves. In the social sciences, you have always objects of study which have already theories about the world as well as about themselves. And for me, these theories are, or these conceptions about themselves and the world are to be captured on three levels. One is the level of facts. Facts about social realities as they are conserved in archives, but also in official statistics, in time series, in all kinds of trajectories that by which we describe the change in the objective world, budgets or number of students at school or whatever have you. These objective data that we find in archives, but also in contemporary statistics and of the output of statistical offices of nation states and so on. A second level is the perceived reality, what people understand about the world in which they live, and that may be very different from the first. It may be distorted, it may be misled, it may be untrue, it may be wishful thinking about the world. And the third one, the third level that you also capture in interviews rather than in archives, is the evaluation of the perceived reality, which may be different from the quote unquote objective reality. So these three levels of phenomena are in interaction with each other. So if things change at the economic or political or fiscal or whatever levels, then people will have to make an interpretation of the lived experience, right? That is the key term of these changes, and they may be distorted and misled and untrue or otherwise. And then you have the third level, the preferences, evaluations, normative expectations, which are not beliefs but are preferences, and they have their positive or negative motivational content. They may be hopes or fears, and other emotions, this complex interaction of facts, beliefs, and preferences is what we want to study. And in macro sociological and historical studies of change, and there are no balanced models where all three elements have come to their specific right. It's very common among sociologists and perhaps also historians to engage in an objectivist distortion, where only the documented facts and uncontested data that we find in archives play a role. But then you get a very strong counter current of methodologies which emphasize preferences and opinions and beliefs, and study society and social changes as a mental phenomenon of actors, rather than of something objective going on there without any evaluations and intentions. So I think the key demand here from a methodological point is to keep a balance between the documentation of known facts and the social processes of interpreting, opinion building, and preference building about these facts and developments. And that's a very demanding job, as we know, to keep the balance between these various elements of the social reality. Thank you.
Thank you. Also to pertaining indirectly to, which has to do, I think also historians, at least I'm also obsessed about how to put that on paper, how to write, to convey all that. And sometimes I use I borrow from literature the term social realism to what I'm doing, but I'm not sure that everybody should do it. But let's. I'm not loud enough. Let's move on to Marta Bucholc. Anyhow, Marta.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. I do not have much to add to what my four speakers already said. And I must say, I did practice both methods separately, but I never tried to do it in one research project at the same time. And that's, I think, because it's very difficult and it requires a lot of skill. And I do not really presume to have the skill, but I am aware of the difficulties of such research and also of the great value of such research. And this value, of course, lies in the possibility to avoid both the objectivist and the subjectivist distortion, so to say. And from this point of view, I would say there are two kinds of things that we may find in an archival research to enhance are qualitative sociological studies, so to say, or not only qualitative, it need not be qualitative, just we might first find what you, Joanna, said was filling the gaps. So there are things I need to know. I might find gaps in the archives to which I may then fill with other methods, that's obvious. But I need to know how these things are because I need to know what reality I'm studying. So this is still related to the point of delineating the field of research, so to say, the object of research. But then there is also an added value of going to the archives, and that's, I'd say this would be the moment when we learn from the archives about the modes of expressing, articulating experience, which are not otherwise accessible to us. Well, an interview is a very good method to get to the articulation of experience, but there are so many other articulations that are only available in an archival research. And that is probably why there was and still is so much criticism of archival materials being underused in historical sociology, and historical sociology either preferring this, grand synthetic approaches, where you really write about the general history of Polish or British or any other society as such, and you never really make the effort to have a look at the history at close quarters, but to get to this micro level, so to say. But there is also, and I must say it's also visible in Polish sociological history, historical sociology, sorry, and this would be the increased interest and the increased use of archival materials, at least in some branches of historical sociology, of which I think we will have a chance to talk later on still. So I will leave that for later. There is an interest in the archives, and there is a great methodological difficulty in going to the archives. For a sociologist, there is this barrier. There is also a barrier in just finding your way around there. I have done very little archive work, but I have done some, and it's difficult. Something that is so very natural for a historian is a minefield sometimes for a sociologist. That's something you need to learn. That's a skill you need to learn. That's a know-how you can only acquire in practice. That's why it's so very admirable if somebody is able to combine this practice with this purely sociological one. And one thing that I would also say, there is one type of materials that I think is being underused in the transformation studies, especially I think in our part of the world. And these are materials which I think provide a unique opportunity of studying experience in a very particular mode of expression that's somehow a very, very fruitful object of research for social science, and these are court files. Studying court files, it has long been done, of course, in history, like Old Bailey studies and things like that, but finding court files for the transformation period after 1989, and not like it's done in constitutional law, not taking the Supreme Courts, constitutional courts. I've been doing it myself, or the legislative files like parliamentary proceedings. No, taking the lowest level, the first instant ordinary court files, and trying to have a look at this, what it tells us about the mode of experience that people are expressing. And this my final be, why do I believe that these materials are so very useful and can be so very fruitful if studied extensively enough? Because they are bringing the subjects to express what their wishes, their preferences, their interests, using very limited scope of means. They are very, very, their field of choice of the form of expression, so to say, is narrowed down drastically in a court proceeding. Therefore, you can really see whether there is something changing in this very, very narrow field. I think it's methodologically really fascinating, and I think this might be a very good example of how archive materials written materials, documents can be brought together with oral history methods and with qualitative sociology methods to get to a really polyvalent view of this basic experience of the transformation.
Okay, thanks a lot, Marta. Yes, the court files. Well, the court files are interesting, of course, because they're also based on orality a lot. Then there's, of course, the question how it is noted down. But yes, well, you called upon a sociologist using archival materials or written sources of different kind. Of course, the writing can be something very directly taken from an oral transmission, but the written, of course, can be also what Claus Offe mentioned, so to say, seemingly objectivized database. Well, I would play that back, and that is kind of my first conclusion. I will be very brief because then I want to open the discussion to the audience. But of course, also the three of you can respond to each other. But anyway, vice versa. I'm sometimes wondering how come that historians, especially in recent periods, they have such a density of social science research, and sometimes actually past social science research available to, to be used, interview files, all that. How come that they, persist on, going to the archive and then uncovering the famous white spots in history? So I think, there's also probably a need of transformation for historians, how to cope with these changed time when you have so much contemporary research and reflection going on, which can be used. A second remark, which maybe is inspiring for the discussion, maybe it's not, I don't know, is about when I heard you talking, especially Joanna, I had the impression, okay, this is still very, in a way related to Durkheim and the very origins of sociology, when you mentioned that there has been a divergence, conflict, and then, you bring the experience to the people, and then there's another circle of communication, and which then might do what? Heal the differences, unite the speakers, reunite society. I think this is already what Durkheim was about, right? But this was just a question. And if that is in these lines of tradition, then of course we might even argue that sociology has maybe a bias for stability and cohesion. And sometimes self-critically I wonder, I mean, the transformation was not just suffering, disruption, deindustrialization, change of thought. It was all pretty exciting, right? For many people, at least for a certain period of time. Of course, also challenging, but so many things people could do which they couldn't do before. And maybe, this positive senses might be lost if we focus very much on disruption and but I might be wrong. I mean, the thought of historians might be in a way in a different direction. If I'm writing history and I'm confronted with paradoxes and what Klaus Offe mentioned, the inconsistencies and conflicts, sometimes it's indeed very difficult to bring that together, just like, an oral source and a written source, a written document, the micro and the macro. And I have this instinct to make sense out of it, right? To explain it. And the very explaining might, with the wisdom of hindsight, of course, might impose a rationality and explainability which wasn't there. So these are just well, this is just an attempt to, not to summarize, to add ideas to the discussion. Now, we have 1.5 hours. We have half an hour left. The three of you, would you like to respond to each other, or should we put it over? Should we hand it over to the general audience right away? The general audience, we discuss in that way. Of course, you can lift the famous Zoom hand, but that can easily be lost. So please insert a plus in the chat. So, you know, when you raise your voice, please insert a plus into the chat, and then, you know, we will go one after the other. So I'm waiting for the pluses in the chat. We're still 83 participants. That's an amazing number. And then we go one after. Okay, now I have already 2 pluses. Cheng Peng, a postdoc researcher at RECET, so a colleague. Then Catherine Liba from Oxford. But first of all, you know, the three of you, do you want to respond to each other? Because maybe you have discovered a conflict, a discrepancy, something you would like to clarify, or should we hand it over to the general audience? Yes, okay, Klaus Offe, you would like to respond to Marta or Joanna, but your microphone is again switched off. So you have to unmute yourself.
No, is this better? Yeah. Okay.
Yes, everything is fine.
Good. No, I wanted to bring up one issue that is that came up in your letter to the members of the panel, namely the distinction between above and from below, from above and from below, as a useful geometrical metaphor or topographical metaphor for understanding. I think this can be, need not be, but can be misleading in that, as we see in the current literature on populism, much of what seemingly comes from below is initiated, licensed, and promoted from above. And so it can be, what do we mean by these topographic metaphors above and below? It's very dangerous to work with these things. Another point I wanted to make is in response to Marta. There is a fascinating find 10 years ago or so. Someone in I forgot the name of the lady, found a huge pile of files, of court files from the GDR, civil law, criminal law, and this is published as a book, and it is fascinating to see the non-legal components in the legal literature and the operation of the court. It is, I mean, if you do you read German? It's published in German. Then I'll be happy to provide you with the title of the book. It is really the lived experience of a state socialist authoritarian regime at the micro level of court files. So I very much agree that this is a very useful thing to use in historical research, but it has been found by sheer accident, and it's a wonderful book that came out of this.
Okay, thank you. I will not refer to the, top down or from below question, because we have so many people who have lifted their hands by putting a plus. Now, I think, this is a theory roundtable, so we don't even have to go by, speakers, people and the, questions back and forth, but we can really open this up and go around. And so I'll, for at least for a while, I did not collect comments and questions. Sheng, you're first.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
As Professor Ther said, I'm a postdoc fellow here at RECET. I have a question about how to engage in different audiences where telling the story of transformation. I remember Russian historic sociologist Alexander Yuchak, when he wrote the book on the last Soviet generation in English, and a few years later, when he was trying to translate himself into Russian, he had to rewrite the book entirely because he was dealing with a different generation, different linguistic group, and entirely cultural and ideological gap between the liberal West and audience back in the former Soviet Union. Do you find similar challenges yourself, and any tips for our younger historian who's trying to engage in this topic? And thank you.
Thanks a lot. Kate, Leo.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is such an interesting conversation, and so it's making lots of thoughts sort of pop around in my head, which may not be entirely coherent, but I've been thinking about the challenges of doing contemporary history, something I've not done myself, in light of the idea that the past is another country. So there's an experience of estrangement or alienation, theoretically, hypothetically, in studying a different period that, creates these sort of productive tensions and enables perhaps us to see things in different ways. Adding a layer to that is the question of archival research, because I recently had this very strange experience. I'm working with qualitative sociological sources as my main sources, but I've gone to try to supplement that in the archives. And I've encountered this experience not of estrangement in the archive, but of feeling a sense of identification with the gaze of the authors of those sources in the archives, who are like myself, sort of English speaking. It just so happens that they were sort of the American Friends Committee going into Poland in 1919 and investigating the condition of the poor war refugees whose memoirs I had been reading. So now I was looking at those memoirs from the outside, and in a way, through the eyes of someone who's using terms of reference that were much more familiar to me. So, incoherent question, but how do we engage critically with our own situatedness, as Joanna mentioned at the beginning, in contemporary history? How can engaging with discourses of power in the archives help us develop a more critical stance, can it estrange our experience of the recent past? Thank you.
Thanks a lot. That of course goes into a very different direction from the first statement, but there's the commonality about distance and closeness to the research object. So we might come back to that. Next one is Agata Zisiak.
Yes, hi. Can you hear me? Great. Okay, I have a question about production of knowledge, and I use a Polish case, but however, I think we can make it broader question. There are at least two books and lots of articles trying to propose some kind of a narrative about what sociologists were writing about transition, transformation, and so on. And recently we are facing something what is called people's turn, zwrot ludowy, or popular turn in general in history, but I think we can talk about social sciences more broadly. And would you dare to propose any kind of this interpretation via paradigms or schools in writing about transition, about transformation that happened through the 90s, 2000s, and so on? And do you see this kind of people's turn coming for social sciences recently? Thank you.
Thanks a lot. That is a epistemological question. Let's move on to Lynn.
Can you all hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
So, hi, my name is Ling, and I'm also a postdoctoral fellow here at RECET. And I'm afraid that I may also have a bit of an incoherent question, but nevertheless, I'll try to ask it. So, my current project at RECET is an entangled history between Poland and Vietnam. And I often find myself in some kind of almost schizophrenic situation, because in Poland, there was an overproduction almost of knowledge on the archives. There was an archive fever that keeps on lasting, I feel, and people are really interested in the past. So it's not just, you know, purely political, but I think there is a true interest in the past. Let's put it like that. And there's also a lot of methodological publications on how to navigate the archives in Poland and reflections on history as a method. Whereas in Vietnam, I think it's very hard to even like draw the contours of a social transformation. Is it the Thoi Bokap, or is it already the 86, the reforms that followed the Chinese economic reforms in Vietnam? And so this poses a completely different set of questions. So one has to be inherently interdisciplinary, because the archives are there, but they are just not accessible. And it's always about being creative, how to access personal archives, how to navigate this different a completely different reality. And I realized that this frustration with the inability to access archives in Vietnam also has something to do with a Eurocentric way of thinking about the archives and knowledge production, because the assumption is that we have the stable archives, we have this people, like historians, who translate them to the younger generation, whereas in Vietnam, it's a completely different situation. So my question would be, I guess, also probably to Sheng, like, how do we navigate that? How do we kind of take the bits of knowledge that we have from studying Europe or the US or whatever, and kind of try to translate that and adapt to kind of non-European context, such as the Vietnamese one, without, or like in a way that we consciously try to not reproduce some kind of Eurocentric patterns of knowledge production or thinking. I know that's a very good question, but it really is an important one for me.
Okay, the interesting thing about Eurocentrism is that it is indeed a unique term. but Occidentalism, but I've never heard about Asiacentrism, but definitely probably something needs to be culturally dependent, and it comes back to thanks, Lynn, for the question about, how to be, do we need to be culturally specific? I think this is a large issue which is very important indeed. Alex Rankovic is next, and I hope the panelists agree that we're still collecting, to make this rather a conversation, a circulating conversation than a back and forth kind of situation. So Alex Rankovic, you're next.
Thank you very much. I have a question regarding the notion of experience, and I will try to be very concise in a way. A few things I think have come up in the discussion on oral history as a method and its relationship with archival research, and especially how the interpretation and representations of different subjectivities or subjective orders can actually contribute to sociological and historical research. And if we talk about the experience of transformation, then precisely I think we have kind of like seen two ways of writing these histories of experience. And on the one hand, we have sort of like historicizing differences and then writing histories of difference, or we have, on the other hand, a mere representation of subjective realities sort of next to each other. And my question then would be, how can we, or how would an approach look like, even if it is possible, even to conceptualize experience as a category of analysis beyond those two modes? So beyond these two modes, on the one hand of representation, and then on the other hand of a mere historicizing differences. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. Jana Osterkamp, you're next.
Thank you so much for the last days for your discussion. And I have a methodological question too. I found it very intriguing to differentiate between the concepts of transition and transformation, and to upheld the kind of ambiguity of our concepts. However, when Klaus Offe added his thought on successes and failures of transformations, I wondered how we do conceptualize failures and successes historically. Because if you're having already a fixed meaning of success, of transformation, that would mean that we have a concept of transition in mind, if you do understand what I mean. So I think maybe in the work of historians, we should more open to the ambiguities of successes as well. For example, if Philipp Ther, you have shown in your book on neoliberalism that failures could turn into successes and vice versa. So how we do introduce the concept of success or failure into our thinking about transformation.
Thanks a lot. Well, the subjectivity of all that and the intersubjectivity. If it is okay with our three distinguished panelists, we have three more voices. So I would, or maybe four, I don't know. Christoph Augustinovic, I saw a hand. If you, Christoph, if you want to add to the discussion, please put a plus, and then, of course, I'm happy to take you up. Next one, however, now is Janusz Kovac.
Yes, do you hear me? Okay. Now my question, actually Philipp started to ask the question. Now let me elaborate on that a little bit. So the longer we talk about transformation, I'm getting more and more sad and frustrated. We started with the concept disembeddedness. This was Joanna. Then came Marta with uneasiness, trouble. Then Klaus, confusion, enemy. Yesterday we were talking about backlashes and backsliding and all these tragic concepts. Now, this seems to be a kind of Leidensgeschichte, so a kind of narrative of suffering. Now, can't we change a little bit the focus? Now, let me invoke a not very popular ally. This would be Leszek Balcerowicz, and I think Klaus will remember the story. We were sitting in the library of the Institute for Human Sciences in 1990, and we wanted to launch a new project on the social costs of the transformation. Then Leszek Balcerowicz stormed into the room and said, I hate this title, let's change this, and let's talk about, instead of social costs, let's talk about social benefits of the transformation. Now, at that time, I thought that this is very apologetic. Now, 30 years after, I'm really somehow longing for a more optimistic story or a less biased story. So what will we leave to the next generations? I mean, just this Leidensgeschichte, or can we have a more balanced story, which is not about backlashes and backsliding and frustration and things like that? Now, I know that is a very general question. I just wanted to express my mood also as a participant of the transformation. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. It's a sunny afternoon, and it's always good to convey that in the discussion. Okay, Piotr, and then I think then afterwards, Rakesh, I see you now. Christoph, please a plus if you want to say something, but soon we need to close to have some time for the panelists to reflect upon all they have heard. Piotr.
So thank you for giving me voice. I have a kind of theoretical question or remark that maybe one way of training historical, or I don't know, sociological imagination around transformation is thinking about counterfactual history. And because somehow from all what have been taught today, events disappear, like historical events, and transformation is full of events that were perceived or are narrated by historians, by by general public, by ordinary people as big experiences, whether, I don't know, Roundtable, whether visit of the Pope, whether solidarity, whether Berlin Wall, whatever. There are many in many countries, and they are, whether for good or bad reasons, they are narrated as a strong events, as a kind of, so we need a kind of eventful sociology of transformation. Otherwise, we will not grasp it, because so this is one point, I think, and thinking about processes of historical and social change without events, like, let's say, like switching off the nuclear power plant, in Germany, let's say. So this is a process. Is it transformation or not? That could be a theoretical question. There is no big event. It is a process. Because of technology, it cannot be done from day to day. Yes, Chernobyl could be done from. It was catastrophe. It's not transformation. So we have these two, and this is maybe a good comparison. This is one. Another thing is whether we really need to search for an omniscient, like, external narrator that would grasp whole reality. This is, I think, an attempt here, and I think we fail if we try to do it, because I think after linguistic, postmodern, whatever turn, it's impossible to get such a narrative for historical. So we have to be situated, we have to be limited in our pretensions to narrate the past, and so it's kind of always relevant. Transformation towards or against something, or in some frames, in some temporal frames. So this is the second point. The third point might be about different temporalities. So there are things that don't change. In modern society, people, I don't know, get up and go to work or stay at home office now for 8 hours because they are, of course, not all work experience changes, and we all know that, but as a scheme, yes. And whether it was in 1988 or in 1992, in the most offices in Poland, people work from 8 to 4 p.m. or 9 to 5. Yes, so there was no much transformation in the working pattern of clerks, let's say, or factories, if they still existed. So there, if we see different spheres of reality, different layers of reality, but still these people in these offices narrate probably about big transformation, because in between 1988 and 1992, there was Roundtable, there were Balcerowicz reforms, and so on, so on. So that might not affect very much their daily routine, but their Lebenswelt, let's say, or symbolic reference from interpretation of the experience on the big political identity level has changed. Maybe not all, of course, allude to that. So and this is something between also experience, subjective, objective. Yes. So maybe these three. I don't want to prolong that. I had more points, but these three maybe are strong enough for discussion.
Thanks, Piotr, and also thanks for coming. Now, if you have a really short one, then please add it. But then we need to hand over to the speakers, because it's already 7:30, and we can go 10 minutes over time, but not much more. Okay, not more actually.
Let me just intervene with a short caveat that I would defend going to archives, and this on a universal level. I teach this course for 2 years. The methodology of history, and in India, it is the historians who actually set the agenda, not the sociology or economists. And the battlefront here is history. And therefore, what method you apply and what kind of presuppositions you have, premises you have, matters to the kind of society that we are trying to build up. So in this sense, therefore, going to archive is so important because it also opens up solidarities across people. It doesn't parochialize or provincialize you. And therefore, once I take archive as my premise as a historian, I don't distinguish between Oriental and Occident, because we understand each other's presuppositions. We understand each other where to critique, where to support. Therefore, irrespective of the schools of history, for example, in India, nobody takes C.A. Bailey or Cambridge historian that seriously at a historians gathering, because they know the presupposition that their defense or apologetic of the empire. So it is in this sense, therefore, while memories while ethnographic details are going to feel are important for a historian, for a substantive history or substantive account of transformation that Professor Ther and Kovacs and all are trying to invoke us to do, I think archive remains very, very central. And I give you a small anecdote that will see us where even in the Eastern Europe, how a sociologist, an anthropologist, I would rather call anthropologist an American anthropologist and an American historian differ. A very close friend of mine who recently died, Keith Hitchens, he said, Rakesh, I've discovered that people told me that there are 5 files, security files on me. And everybody wants me to go and check those files. But I never thought and felt like going and doing that. He never did that. Keith died last year. On the other hand, Catherine Verdery not only finds those files, but writes a full volume on that files. so that the difference between historian and anthropology comes alive in different form. In this sense, therefore, I would privilege a substantive history where there's nothing wrong in going to archives, and new archives are being added. And therefore, the question is not about archives, not about anthropology. Question is, what is the question that the society is asking to itself? And that, I think, informs us whether I'm a historian, whether I'm a sociologist. This is what I tell my students, and this I feel strongly. The question that the society is looking towards, looking for, asking itself, becomes the kind of dominant ask.
Thank you. Rakesh. I mean, you also kind of, you basically gave an answer to an issue which was brought up by Aga Pasheka in the chat. The solutions to the history and sociology problems might be anthropology, and you put it up on the table. Okay. Now we are already beyond the time. I think it was a very good discussion. It's dealing with, I would say, 3 large issues. Cultural specificity and the relation to the research object, 1. Second, the production of knowledge. And 3, the conveying and narrating the knowledge, interpreting it. And this will be my last words. Back to the panelists. Maybe just let's keep the sequence. So Joanna Wawrzyniak, Klaus Offe, and then Marta Bucholc. You have the last word. Not too long ones, but I hope you liked it, enjoyed it, liked the discussion.
I will try. Well, first of all, thank you so much to both Professor Offe and Marta for the really insightful talks and for all the questions. So I don't even dare to answer all of them, but I would like to combine 2 of them. So one is Agata and Janos' question together, if I might. Janos, I don't think we spoke about that much about the transformation as the Leidensgeschichte, but more of sociology as the Leidensgeschichte, which cannot really grasp transformation, even if it tries. So there is lots of ambiguity in the concept of sociologists, which can't really still grasp that what's going on. So that they look for the concepts, and so that's one thing. The other, and this also it relates already to Agata's question, how actually the transformation was narrated by the social science or sociology on the ground. I think that there was a lot of optimism in the 1990s. So that was the main thing, and that was all this idea of transition, not the transformation, of going from one point to another. Lots of the kind of the applied research with the question, where are we going, how far we are still from our goals, because there were these still goals, and then and so on. And the second, I would say, generation became more critical to that, and there was this second wave of research, which was very much, at least in Poland, influenced actually by Elizabeth Dunn research, which was Agata, yes, anthropologist, who brought us closer to society. So we needed an American sociologist to come and to tell us that. But also the social science became more critical, and I obviously no time to develop it fully. But it is an observable trend. But what is really interesting right now, I would say, it is that the critique or a kind of the attack and the premises of the transformation by the populist parties make, I would say, some of the left scholars, but also of the left public intellectuals right now, more, I would say, hesitant about the very critique of the premises of the transformation as they seen them before. So that's a really interesting, I would say, marginal, but still interesting trend that the left critics, some of them became less critical as they were before. So that's one couple of questions which I just wanted to briefly answer. And the other one was about, I really love all these questions about how we work with all that, and share questions about how we work to different audiences. I think we just need to write different books to different audiences, and that's, I know it's awful, but it is. So we just do that, and it's especially awful if we need to do it in different languages. So it's not only the national publics are different, and you just need to have different narratives to get to them, but also the international, and that's life. Sorry, all this. But to Kate, I don't think there is. I don't find that much difference between dealing with the subjectivities of the present time and of the past time. So if I go to the archives and I read whatever the 19th century materials, I don't see that's, that really there is such a huge distance, which makes me more objective toward that what I'm writing, that if I'm doing and recording the interview, and which I can see the person, like, moving her body, the way she, but I don't really see kind of the real crucial difference between these two approaches. But that's another question for a big discussion. So maybe I just stop here, and yeah, we'll see what Professor Offe and Marta will add to all this. Thank you.
Klaus Aufe, you were already called up. Just looking at the picture, the micro, we don't hear you yet. But
can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, very, very good. I have just 2 points. One is to Janos and a few other speakers on the question, can we make a clear distinction between success and failure? And again, I would say, yes, we can. And we can do so by asking people who have lived through the process of transformation. And what were their hopes? What were the promise they believed in? And what is their current experience? And there are very good data, for instance, by the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, comparing countries, who is happy with the outcome and who is not so happy, and who is in between. And I remember a data set from the early, from 2006, I think, which shows that the sense of frustration or the sense of disappointment is distributed according to age categories. The youngest are the happiest, and income categories. The wealthiest are the happiest. And in some countries, and I think that includes Hungary, the results are such that only the young and the successful have a happiness rate of more than 50%. All the other categories are below. And that links to the second point I wanted to make. I mean, put it simplistically, history is not just present in the archives. History is present in the memories of people who reflect upon their experience. And there is a new kind of literature starting with the French authors Eribon and Ernaud, but now spreading everywhere. And I have just read a what I call an auto-ethnography of a Albanian philosopher. And she describes in much detail her life history embedded in the political and economic developments of her country. And I think this is not an academic source and not an archival source, but is still something that can be extremely useful as a kind of literature which we can use for the study of transformations and the memories that are accumulated in the process of transformation. And this has also the author of a autobiography, American hillbilly elegy, maybe some very, very useful, a social history of one person and his or her biography. And that can be extremely stimulating in thinking about transformations. Thank you.
Okay, I'm admonished rightly that very, very soon we have the speaker of the next panel, Larry Wolf, entering to check up all technical stuff and so on. Nevertheless, Marta, you now have the indeed the last word.
No. Well, I didn't prepare any big last words, so I just say thank you very much. And I'll just, as a response, I have to say, Janos, good old Durkheim, apropos the Leidensgeschichte, even a change for the better may make people unhappy. That's the paradox of social life, but that's one thing. And now the questions of Sheng and Catherine, I think these are very important questions. And here I beg to disagree with Joanna. I think I put great hope in social theory as a mode of communicating findings, as a mode of structuring findings to make them intelligible somehow, well, conditionally, but somehow making them also capable of bridging cultural differences, not linguistic differences, obviously. That's yet, as a translator, I can tell you it's hell, but of course there is a chance in that. And I put my hope in that. And there is also a bit of hope for this distancing that you mentioned, Catherine. I wanted to relate an experience of my own when studying letters wrote by prisoners who were not allowed to vote and who felt deprived of their citizenship. And these were very touching documents archived by the Polish ombudsperson. I studied that a few years ago. And I do feel this difficulty in distancing myself from this kind of materials and from accounting for my own situatedness. But then I put a lot of hope in the methodology. I put a lot of hope in these methodological distances that is a part of our training, of course. And it might be naive of me, but I really do believe that's the best weapon we have against the complexity and contingency of social historical reality. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very, very much. It was the last word. You ended with social reality, and narrative translation of that would be, so to say, social realism. Stay tuned, because now the reality is that this panel is ending. Thanks to all of you for your great statements at first. Claus Offe, Marta Bucholc, and Joanna Wawrzyniak. Applause, applause, applause. I think it was really terrific. You launched a very productive discussion. Thanks for discussants, for your great questions and comments. I think all of them were really, really important. I think it was a great event.